In the decades following the establishment of the People's Republic of China, China becomes increasingly militant. Its leader is bent on showing China's place in the world. Mao Zedong. But at the height of the Cold War, a key ally will turn enemy: India. In 1959, Mao launches a personal attack on Indian Prime Minister Jawaharlal Nehru. The issue of Tibetan independence rips the alliance apart. By 1962, a bitter border war turns India from friend to foe. Even today, these events remain sensitive topics. Both sides disagree on what happened. But for the first time, we will hear personal accounts from the men who served in China's People's Liberation Army. This is the story of Mao's Cold War with India. The Tibetan Plateau in 1959. In one of the world's highest and most remote regions, tension is brewing. 20-year-old Wang Sheyao is a new recruit in the People's Liberation Army.
我叫王世尧，现年72岁，我是58年从扶贫草群中学参军的。当时那个参军，大家都踊跃报名的，因为这个对当兵这个人思想呢，也就是，对这个当兵很崇拜。
Wang serves for barely 3 months when a rebellion breaks out in Tibet. This is a catalyst that will set India and China on a path to a border war.
当时我没有多少了解，对这个当兵到底还是咋弄啊？那这主要考虑的是没有点子，和平兵。
Isolated by the world's highest mountain ranges, Tibet lies in the southwest of China and to the north of India. Tibet's history with China is long and complex, dating back as early as the 7th century. Her position with China alternating between subservience and independence. By the 20th century, Tibet considers itself autonomous. But in 1949, things change with the founding of the People's Republic of China. The top leader in China wants to stamp China's sovereignty on the region. Party chairman Mao Zedong. Mao considers Tibet a part of China. He sends a massive force of troops into the region. Over the next 9 years, Beijing reasserts its control. But by 1959, Tibet is on the verge of a rebellion.
1959年就是4月左右，那部队上已经动员了，因为西藏高级、西藏军区。 还会把那西藏军区还包围了。
Mao blames the rebellion on the upper class of Tibetan society, labeling them reactionary. He claims the rebellion is an internal dispute and forbids any foreign interference. But one of Tibet's neighbors is closely following the clampdown: India. This is how India views its borders with Tibet. They have suddenly become India's borders with China. This rebellion won't just upset China's internal affairs. It will taint India's and China's relationship forever. 10 years earlier, though, the picture is different. China and India forge a friendship almost immediately after the founding of the People's Republic of China. The two have common grounds, being newly independent and the two most populous countries in Asia. The leader that spearheads their friendship, Prime Minister Jawaharlal Nehru.
Nehru 是印度独立后第一任领导人，就是他长期担任印度的总理。他也愿意给中国发展有友好关系，因为中印两国之间在反对帝国主义侵略、反对殖民主义统治方面有共同立场。
On China's side is Premier Zhou Enlai, a highly ranked official key in cementing this relationship.
周恩来是中国建国以后第一任外交部长了，他是总理兼外交部长，这说明当时中国的中央政府对这对外交也是非常重视的。
In 1954, Zhou attends the Geneva Conference. In a speech, he praises India as a leader of the non-aligned movement. Countries considered neutral in the communist-capitalist divide.
Zhou Enlai did have friendship with Nehru, and he tried to maintain that. And he sees that as a very much a foundation, a Sino-Indian kind of alliance, a foundation for the entire non-alignment movement.
Sino-Indian relations reach new heights 1 year later during a meeting of newly independent Asian and African states. The Bandung Conference. Both India and China pledge their goals of leading this new world order. But cracks soon begin to appear in their relationship. Mao has reservations about getting too close.
Mao seems more suspicious about the leadership of those newly independent countries than Zhou Enlai was. Because for Mao, the temptation of Moscow's support or Washington's support is always there. And China is strategically and economically limited in that regard. So he tries to keep distance between himself and the leaders of newly independent countries.
A rivalry begins to grow.
After the Bandung Conference, there was a power struggle developing between Beijing and Delhi because both of them see themselves as the leader of the emerging non-Western world, independent countries in Asia and Africa.
But the issue that will bring these cracks to a head, the rebellion in Tibet. As China's army clamps down, Beijing extends its political and military control to Tibet's entire territory.
在这之前，中国人民解放军一直没有到边境，因为西藏地方嘛，由西藏地方来管辖，就没有真正把部队严格布置在边防地区。
China has two contested borders with India, an eastern and a western sector. In 1914, Britain and Tibet signed a treaty stating the McMahon Line, the boundary separating Tibet and India. But China has never recognized this treaty. It claims the border lies 90,000 square kilometers further south. China also disputes India's claim to land in the west, an area called Aksai Chin. During the 50s, Beijing builds a key highway across Tibet. It cuts across Aksai Chin. The Xinjiang-Tibet Highway is a crucial artery for China's troops into Tibet.
In 1957, when they discovered that the road from Xinjiang to Lhasa had been built through Aksai Chin, which India had considered its territory in the western sector, India realized that there needed to be a more active policy of trying to occupy these areas, trying to show presence on these areas. And the Chinese had moved closer to the boundary with India because of the uprising and the disturbances in Tibet. So it was inevitable that the two sides would come into contact.
With the border in contention and troops stationed on both sides, blood will soon spill. China's army has remained in Tibet since 1950. Its neighbor, India, is tense as thousands of Chinese troops pour into Tibet. Over the next decade, many Tibetans feel Beijing's reforms disregard their culture and traditions. By 1959, Tibetan objection to China's policies has reached boiling point. In March, rumor spreads that Chinese authorities plan to abduct the Dalai Lama to Beijing. Hundreds of thousands of Tibetans surround his palace to protect him.
Rumors that the Dalai Lama was going to be taken were instantly and uncritically accepted, and that indicates that there'd been a complete collapse of faith or trust between Tibetan people and the PRC.
Mao predicts there will be massive rebellion in Lhasa. But he doesn't view this as a crisis. He considers it an opportunity.
Mao certainly had a very different personality, personal character that many other people don't have. Mao has a combination of a strong-willed person. He's ambitious, he's ruthless. The sort of siege mentality to Mao is also good because you can utilize a crisis situation to motivate, to encourage the people.
Mao says, the more chaotic the situation in Tibet, the better. It will give reason to crush the rebellion and carry out reforms in the future. Thousands of new recruits like Wang Xiyao rally behind Mao.
我对毛主席斗争的很崇敬，他怎么说我就怎么做。我对这两个人是非常崇拜，叫我死去我就死去。
On the 19th of March 1959, China begins its crackdown on Lhasa. The army easily takes back the capital, but the rebellion spreads to the remote mountainous regions. For the next 3 years, Chinese troops scour Tibet for rebel strongholds. One of the biggest rebellions erupts on Namtso Lake. Twenty-year-old Private Tian Du Lai barely makes it out alive.
所以说59年的7月6号下午，当时我们在那个纳木湖的东端湖边上正在做饭吃。突然是土匪要从我们的前方有东端那块要逃跑。
当时我们发现是600多敌人，600多敌人扑袭了以后，那目的就是不让他跑掉，把他消灭。
当时呢，在追击敌人，其实向前进的时候啊，就这个地形啊。 就是也很复杂，但是那个雾很大，能见度很低。突然间，右前面又发现一个敌人，这时候班长立即命我们全班都卧倒，卧倒以后就开始向敌人射击。就在这个时候呢，突然一个敌人从那旁边坎子下边，向班长连开2枪。 班长胸部中弹，然后班长就牺牲了。
一直打，这一共前没很打，一共打到这个1、2点钟。这当时打的是那过程当中那很激烈。
因为当时那敌人那个叛匪啊，他就是用那个大马刀，那也挺残忍的，也挺野蛮的那家伙。左右2个敌人也向我同时包围了，我这一转圈，想跳出那个坑啊，我这条腿都拔不出来。因为这时候呢，连长就冲上把那敌人消灭了以后，在我晕倒的时候，他就派人呀，就是把我朝死救。
But across the border, India's public opinion is overwhelmingly sympathetic to Tibet.
From the point of view of the Indian public, it has to be remembered that India has had long historical connections with Tibet. Cultural, economic, religious. And so whatever the Chinese were doing in Tibet, especially religious suppression, were issues that affected the Indian public.
But Mao does not understand why Nehru allows the Indian public to criticize China.
That takes us to the heart of one of the biggest problems in this conflict. This tendency on the part of Mao to assume that other statesmen would do as he did. And if they weren't, then there must be some ulterior motive or some hidden agenda. He made a rather glib assumption that Nehru had a similar degree of control or influence over the expressions of Indian opinion.
At a public demonstration in New Delhi,
India's public sympathy toward Tibet even irks Premier Zhou Enlai. But the Chinese Communist Party decides to lie low, waiting for the right time to settle the score. As the violence in Lhasa worsens, the Dalai Lama fears for his life. Disguised as a soldier, he flees to India.
thousands crowd the railway station in New Delhi to welcome the Dalai Lama. There are shouts of, "Long live Tibet's freedom."
But according to China's official line, the Dalai Lama was hijacked by Tibetan rebels. In India, he is granted asylum. Mao is furious. In a statement to the Indian public, the Dalai Lama speaks of the oppression of his people at the hands of the Chinese. He also calls for Tibet to be independent of China.
Dalai Lama's speech just made matters much worse. But the really bad reaction on Mao's part was to assume that if the Dalai Lama was being given asylum in India and being allowed to make such provocative and aggressive statements in public, then it must be because Nehru and the Indian government wanted to use these public statements for a policy agenda of their own.
Mao believes now is the right time to expose India's purported role in the rebellion. He declares Nehru the mastermind behind the protests, hoping to seize Tibet for himself. In just 2 short months, the 2 Asian brothers turn into bitter adversaries. Both stake claims to lands on their borders and begin sending troops to fortify them. The world's 2 most populous nations will soon open fire on each other. March 1959. Mao claims the Indian Prime Minister Jawaharlal Nehru is behind the Tibetan rebellion. Nehru, on the other hand, is worried about an expansionist China. These differences will soon expose their border disputes to the world.
The sheer geographical fact that there were undemarcated border regions right next to Tibet, this was a car accident waiting to happen.
August 1959. Along the McMahon Line on the Sino-Indian border in Longju, a bloody clash breaks out between Chinese and Indian border garrisons.
双方开枪这个事件是中印之间在边界问上第一次出现这样的现象，所以引起了当时社会的国际上的重视。中印边界问题开始在这样突出去了。
Then in October 1959, on the western section of the border at Kongka Pass. Chinese and Indian soldiers open fire again. China's key ally is closely watching the deteriorating situation: the Soviet Union. In 1959, the successor to Stalin has been in power for 6 years: Nikita Khrushchev. Throughout the Sino-Indian fallout, Mao feels Khrushchev hasn't been behind China. After Chinese and Indian soldiers clash, Khrushchev issues a statement regretting the tragic incident. Chinese leaders deem this a betrayal.
当时中国政府是之前啊，就是一再劝阻说你不要发表这样的言论，你不要表明你要秉公办事，你要保持中立，这不是中立。当一个共产党的国家和一个非共产党的国家，当一个社会主义国家和非社会主义国家发生争端的时候，你本来你是共产党国家，你也是社会主义国家，而且你和另外一个共产党国家是盟友关系，你反而不站在他身边，你反而说保持中立，本身就是一种背叛。当时中国这个是非常生气的，中国领导人是非常生气的。
By the 10th year anniversary of the People's Republic of China, the topic has reached boiling point.
赫鲁晓夫在会上就激烈指责中国，说中国先交火了，实际上是印度先开火了。他认为说是中国打死了印度的士兵了，他甚至说那么个荒凉不毛之地，你们干嘛要为了争那一点领土呢？那就是中国可以放弃自己领土。像这些言论都是 为中方所不能接受的。
Talks with India, however, fare better. China and India come to a consensus over the clashes. They agree to withdraw to 20 kilometers behind the lines of control on both borders. But in reality, the opposite happens. Over the next 3 years, both sides fortify their borders. Troops continue to patrol over the disputed territory. The Chinese are ordered not to open fire if Indian troops come into sight. Beijing does not want to be accused of attacking India, yet. For many soldiers like Private Wang, this is very difficult.
咱们是不开第一枪，印度边防部队的北线的那互相都了解，北线的就是那不分歧，就是大脚踢一下子，东西踢过来，咱们的把东西给你踢过去。
China officially names India's incursions into what it deems its territory a forward policy.
The way the Chinese saw the forward policy was as one that was deliberately provocative. The problem was, of course, on the Indian side. The Indians were merely marking claim to what they thought was their side. So, in a sense, the forward policy was not one only employed by the Indian side, but there was one employed by the Chinese side as well.
The Sino-Indian agreement has not worked. But back in Beijing, Premier Zhou is hesitant on taking a fiercer stance. As foreign minister, he is very wary of how China is perceived in the world. In just 10 years, China has fought wars in Korea, the Taiwan Straits, and Vietnam. By 1960, China is reluctant to make more enemies. To put an end to the Sino-Indian border dispute, Zhou visits New Delhi to offer an olive branch. He suggests China will stay behind the Western McMahon Line if India gives China more land on the eastern border, the Aksai Chin. But Nehru rejects the proposition, and Zhou goes home empty-handed. Mao is furious yet again.
说现在看来，这仗是非打不打不行了，没有退路了。
Mao issues the secret order to begin preparing for combat. The stage is set for war. The year is 1962. For 3 years, China and India have been in a stalemate over their border disputes. Troops on both sides have sporadically opened fire. But in September, an event provokes an all-out Chinese attack. On the eastern border, the Indian army establishes a post in Cherdong, near the McMahon line. The Chinese consider this their territory and surround the post. The Indian commander reports they are facing 600 Chinese troops. But to this day, Beijing claims there were only 60. When Nehru orders the Indian army to drive out the Chinese, it's the last straw for Mao. He issues a top-secret order for a coordinated attack across both borders. The People's Liberation Army, or PLA, has been well prepared for this. Beijing has considered this war inevitable since 1960. The army has recruited and trained thousands of men. One of them is Private Ren Linshan.
我叫任林山，是1961年应征入参军。参军前在西安一期工业专科学校学习，还有1年的时间就毕业了。
In preparation for battle, Ren learns Hindi, North India's main language.
9月初，让我到西部去学习战场喊话。最关键的，印度官兵们，你们侵占了我们的俄国领土。
Ren puts his words to use just 1 month later. He is sent to the border on the Eastern Front.
上战场的第一个命令，在13号晚上的宣布，就是这样上的战场呢，说车了什么东西来说都安排好了。第二天早晨9点钟正式上车，其实成了4、5天、5、6天时间。 拉到前线，其他兄弟部队来说，也有道的，也有道的，都在那山背后来说，原始森林里面埋伏着，不允许生火，不允许走枪，不允许走火，不允许高声喊。上了山顶，山顶下边对面山上就是敌人，害怕走漏消息，都是秘密行动。
Just before dawn, the PLA launch a coordinated attack.
当第一发信号弹打上去了以后，那整个来说几十里路都能看见，那是为炮兵来说指挥信号。第二发信号弹一吃膛，这山顶上东西这几百枚大炮还是几千枚大炮，第一发炮弹里跟着第二发信号弹就开始了。
Mao's plans are put into action as Chinese artillery units inflict devastating hits on Indian troops.
这是正面进攻，我们上了山，和敌人来就打个交手战。
At the same time, infantry units are deployed to flank and encircle Indian units. It's a successful battle-tested technique invented by Mao during the Long March.
Chinese had a lot of experience in fighting in this kind of country. They'd been doing it since the 1930s, and they'd done a lot of it in Korea against the Americans. It taught them some important things about fighting in rugged mountain country. In particular, the more you decentralize, the better. The nature of the ground often breaks fighting up in areas like this into skirmishes between small units. So you need to have a force which is prepared to so operate.
On the western border, the PLA attack from the mountainous areas at the same time. They annihilate the Indian defense. By 4 p.m., the first battle is over.
基本上就德巴恰事件，第一仗这就基本上就结束了。这一仗这是一个全胜，对敌人来讲是一个毁灭性的打击，炮灰气的根本没有打死的，全部做了当了俘虏。
This rare film archive shows the moment when the PLA captures the Indian army. In a matter of days, the Chinese capture other strongholds at Cherdong and Kibitu on the eastern front, and strongholds around Pangong Lake on the western front.
The Indians quite simply just didn't expect Chinese units to be able to get to these places as quickly as they could and use the firepower as effectively as they did.
While fighting is ongoing, China appeals to India to settle the dispute through negotiations. Once again, Chinese Premier Zhou Enlai says China will give up the area south of the McMahon Line if India gives up Aksai Chin. But Nehru is incensed. He rejects the proposal and declares a state of emergency in India. Nehru rallies his troops to launch a counterstrike, but Mao is one step ahead. The year is 1962. A border war ensues between India and China. After a series of losses, Indian leader Nehru orders 30,000 Indian troops to launch a counter-offensive. The PLA deploy another 20,000 troops to the eastern sector. Their plan, a punitive and devastating attack that will end the war. But it requires a huge undertaking. Ren Linshan and Tian Dulai of the 11th Division are ordered to flank Diranzong. But the site lies more than 50 kilometers across the Himalayas. Icy rivers and deep ravines lie in the regiment's path.
怎么能到德让州？给11师布置的是打德让州，11师的那必然来说就要接球迂回包围，这就谈到了一个北里小岛。这要说是一个小岛，这根本无路。 不是什么小岛，再不好走，这小岛来说还能通过。你再上其他山，是横跨喜马拉雅山。
The 11th Division hit the trail on November the 10th. They have just over a week to get to Diranzong.
我们部队行了8天8夜，从中的艰苦状况啊，里边翻了几场大山，斗了几个冰河。 要背够10天的干粮，武器弹药是加配，负重一般的都超过60斤到80斤，没有喝过一口开水，没有睡过10分钟以上的觉，没有吃过一顿热饭，那总体来说就没有做饭啊。
那战士到了非常疲惫的情况下，但是上边不是给命令叫停顿，也不叫休息。稍微一慢一会儿，有的人就是正常性就盼走了呀， 也就迷糊了。
心里只有一个决心，只要完成任务，战胜敌人，这就是最大的心愿。
On the morning of November the 18th, the PLA's plan comes to fruition with horrific consequences. The second offensive. By the morning of November the 19th, Indian units are completely wiped out.
Indian forces collapsed. Large number of Indian soldiers became POWs. Chinese forces pressed on into Indian territory.
In New Delhi, a panicked Nehru sends a desperate plea to the US, asking for immediate military support. But unexpectedly, Mao orders a ceasefire. Chinese troops withdraw to 20 kilometers behind the line of actual control. Pre-1959 positions. Nehru is perplexed.
中国为什么要撤退到既然取得全面胜利，为什么撤回原地呢？并不想通过武力来占领领土。
Mao is very wary of how China is perceived in this war. It has just coordinated an attack on a fellow Asian nation and leader of the non-aligned movement. Chinese troops have killed thousands of Indian soldiers. The stage is set for a new act in China's global propaganda offensive. These are the propaganda videos they release to the world. POWs are shown to be well treated. They are even released and escorted back to the border. But for the PLA soldiers who fought in the war, there is a different story. Even today, this subject brings back bitter memories.
我被押送俘虏，那个啥的，你说是吃了3年以后坐下来休息，把我们的干粮、水都让给人家吃，让给人家喝。实际上我们心里的那很气愤，那说那个枪毙了，那如果允许的话，拿枪子把那扫完了。那就国家那个党的政策不允许，党的不准虐待俘虏，那才只能按党的政策办事，把人家安全送达。
这咋能这样的决定呢？这打了胜仗，这认为这一点战利品还要交，非常想不通。相互撤的过程中呀，头一摆看到旁边要给人家交的这些战利品呀，眼泪不由得唰的一下都流下来了。吃了这么大的苦，做出了这么大的牺牲，渐渐的打了胜仗。教会了的武器弹药，这就这样又和交给人家，这仗这不是咱们白打了吗？
Zhou sends a letter to Nehru claiming China has been acting in self-defense this entire time. There is no need for further military action as India, the aggressor, has been repelled, he says.
那么当时呢，是中国是不想把这场边界的冲突演变成两国的交战。 希望呢尽快解决。实际上打的这一场边界冲突目的不是为了打仗，是为了让印度的领导人坐到谈判桌前。当然，最后的这个目的也没有达到。
But the politics of this war is more complex.
And a lot of surprise, therefore, a lot of surprise and some consternation and a lot of discussion about just why China had stopped and where things would go next, and a burst of speculation which lasted for months on what this conflict, what effect it would have on relations between the different major powers.
Mao's Cold War with India would have serious repercussions on its most important alliance. Soviet leader Khrushchev makes it no secret that he considers China the aggressor. With the seeds of distrust planted, China will lose its closest ally. November 1962. The People's Liberation Army have defeated the Indian Army and advanced further south. But instead of pushing further, Mao pulls back his army, and they retreat to 1959 lines. But relations with India will take decades to normalize. To this day, China has not settled its border disputes with India. The lines of actual control, or the LAC, remain heavily fortified.
On the Chinese side, there's been a lot of infrastructure development, and this is one of the reasons why the Indians are even more worried today about what the Chinese are doing along the boundary. The Indians have started moving into territories close to the LAC because given China's military modernization, there are fears in India that India will be caught unprepared once again. So there is this massive military modernization process on both sides and movement of troops closer to the LAC.
For the Chinese veterans who fought in the Sino-Indian conflict, the Cold War was a dangerous era. A period filled with sacrifice and suffering.
通过当兵，通过打仗，这是我一生很重要的一个我个人的一个历史阶段。
这两个战斗对我是影响极大，是我一生没经过的，也锻炼了我，淬炼了我，对意志起到了很大的锻炼。
那确实是没办法形容的，但是这忍受下来，有个啥精神呢？就是那解放军的光荣传统，一不怕苦，二不怕死。我想这个人呀，有了这种精神呀，什么困难就可以克服。我就这个是这样的。
The Sino-Indian War has been instrumental in shaping and molding the mentality of the Chinese leadership. Emerging out of that conflict would be a China just 13 years old. But Mao and his commanders have proved they fear no one. China has shown it is willing to go to war alone to claim land it considers part of itself. But China's war against India has sown the seeds of distrust with its key communist ally.
苏联和印度的关系在热络，当时在中国共产党看来，就是说苏联是在明显的在违背他的这个整个的社会主义的大家庭这个大的事业。
The stage is set for China's next war. The next decade will see the Soviet Union transform from China's #1 ally to her most hated enemy.